Our panel today, of course, is What's Happened to the American Dream. Moderating our panel, and he'll be introducing our distinguished panelists, we have Harold Ford Jr. Harold is a managing director and senior client relationship manager at Morgan Stanley Smith Barney and Morgan Stanley Investment Management. He served 5 terms in the U.S. Congress, representing the 9th District of the great state of Tennessee. He's a board member at Lincoln Center, the Posse Foundation, Weill Cornell Medical College, and American Promise, among others. And he's also an overseer at the International Rescue Committee and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He's also a longtime participant in the Milken Institute Global Conference, and we're delighted to welcome our friend Harold Ford.
Thank you, sir, and good afternoon. Mike, thank you for the introduction and thank you for convening. I thank Mike Milken and all of those who organized this conference. I think we can all agree it has been as successful, if not more so, as it does year after year, building on its success. I'm delighted to be joined by 4 great thinkers, 4 great doers, 4 men who care deeply. I wish I could say a few women, but 4 men who care deeply about this country, who care deeply about the American dream, and are as opinionated as they come about how we fix our challenges and put the country on a better course. First, from my right to your left, is my friend Neil Ferguson, the Lawrence A. Tiss Professor of History at Harvard University, Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. He himself an author of 12 books. Between 1998 and 2008, 5 of those books were New York Times bestsellers. One of the nation's foremost thinkers on economics and finance and the intertwining of culture and finance and helping us understand not only how markets work, but how markets can work better. Neil, welcome, and thank you for being here, too. Next to Neil is Jeff Green, investor, philanthropist, the president of Florida Sunshine Investments USA. He obtained great notoriety, becoming one of the first to recognize the housing bubble in 2006. Himself active politically, a candidate for the United States Senate from Florida just a few years ago, and one who understands as well the connection and the marriage between politics, the economy, and finance. Jeff, thank you for being here and look forward to your comments. To my left and to your right, the great Charles Murray, one of the most noted social scientists and libertarians in the country, has written extensively on the importance of culture and the impact that it has had on the American dream. Recently published, his book, Coming Apart, thank you, sir, which in many ways I think serves as a moniker for this program or for this effort and for this luncheon as we talk about the American dream. We look forward to your thoughts and thank you for being here. Finally, on my far left to your right, Steve Ratner, former counselor to the Treasury Secretary and lead auto advisor to the Secretary and to the President, the chairman of Willett Advisors, and a frequent contributor to a show that I happen to love and it's near and dear to my heart, Morning Joe. Steve, thank you for being here and look forward to your comments. Charles, I want to start with you. There is a train of thought in the country that believes that the American dream has been imperiled for a few reasons, largely income inequality, the growing income inequality in the country, exacerbated by the fact that the top 1%, probably many represented in this room, if not all of us in this room, who have been enriched, some would argue, by tax policy and other policies in this country. There are those who believe that this dysfunction in Washington, as bad as it is for the country, that it really impacts middle and lower income Americans more. And this is really a conversation about politics and policy in that regard, but you differ. You argue that cultural issues and the cultural divergence has had as big an impact on changing and impacting negatively the ability to attain the American dream. Why do you believe that, and how wrong do you think, as much as you believe that, do you think that there are those who believe the economy and economic issues and income inequality, that those forces don't play some role?
Oh, of course they play some role. There's no question about that. But we have a cultural inequality that, to me, is a lot more threatening. And it's represented in this room, actually. The thesis of the book I wrote is that we have a new upper class and a new lower class that are different in kind from anything we've had in the United States before. And if you want to talk about the way that the new upper class is different, you're it. If we'd had a gathering of the upper class as of 1960, it would have been a much different kind of place. It would have had an awful lot of high school diplomas represented in it and no more. It would have been geographically much more diverse in the places that you live than this is. All of you, basically, in this room, not only have degrees and probably advanced degrees, an awful lot of those came from a small number of elite institutions, and you also live in zip codes that are not only extremely wealthy and well-educated, but are surrounded by other zip codes that are extremely wealthy and well-educated. You get married later than most of the rest of Americans. You have your children later. Ever noticed how geriatric the parents are at back-to-school night at the schools your kids go to? You raise your kids somewhat different than in mainstream America. You very seldom stock your fridge with Coors or Budweiser. It's always some nice little dark beer made by Belgian elves. You either don't have a TV at all anymore, or you do, but you use it to watch DVDs or Downton Abbey. And if you really are going to live it up, you know, maybe Mad Men and House, but you don't have the TV on 35 hours a week, which is the national average. And above all, you are a whole lot skinnier than mainstream America. This is an act of rebellion on my part. We live in a culture that bears very little resemblance to mainstream America. Those of you in this room who grew up in working class and middle class households nonetheless remember what it is like in mainstream America. Those of you who did not, and especially your children, have grown up in a world and know nothing else except that world. Okay, so that's, I'm not going to go on much longer with this. I'm trying to get across, money is the least of what separates you from mainstream America. And one quick example for the new lower class.
You just said they all live in wealthy neighborhoods. How does money not play some
You know what's even more important than the money is the education and the socialization that goes along not only with education but with elite education, because a lot of these common tastes and preferences are driven not by the money. They're driven by that kind of common tastes and preferences. Oh, there's one other thing that separates you. You're a lot smarter in terms of average IQ than a similar group would have been before, because you were part of a meritocracy that got very efficient in identifying talent. One quick statement, and I'll stop on this. I've gone on longer than I intended. If you want to talk about the new lower class, here is an example of how different that's become. Back in 1960, marriage, that central cultural institution, was virtually universal. 84% of the white working class was married, ages 30 to 49. 2010, marriage is still real close to universal in the upper middle class. It's down to 48% in the white working class. A huge cultural change.
Steve, you developed a public policy in the last year or so that in the last 2 years, that many credit with saving our auto industry. Public policy clearly plays a role in helping to address this. I mean, obviously, Professor Murray, Dr. Murray has his thoughts, but how do you balance the public policy versus the cultural? Because I think one can argue that a two-parent household is important, but it probably, I don't know of any poor person that doesn't want to live in one of these zip codes we've talked about, and I don't know of any rich person lives in one of these zip codes that would want to trade places with someone who lives in a poor zip code. How does public policy affect this, and what role, you acknowledge that culture does, but what role does public policy play in all of this?
Look, first of all, I'm not a sociologist, so in terms
Neither am I, actually.
Well, you fake it very well. So in terms of one parent, two parents, and all that, I'll leave that to you or to others. So I'm a finance guy, I'm an economics guy, and I look at the numbers. And the numbers tell me that we have gone further and further apart. I think that's obvious to everybody. And I think that is part of what people care about. I don't think we want to turn this panel into a debate about what is happiness and what is the American dream and all that, but certainly a better standard of living for yourselves and for your kids is a part of it. And government does play a role in that. It plays a role on the tax side, it plays a role on the spending side. I think everybody here is probably familiar by now with the IRS data about the 400 wealthiest Americans whose tax rate went from 30% in 1995 to 17% in 2007. I don't think there are many people further down in the income ladder who could say that their tax rates went down as much. I think everybody's familiar with some of what's been happening to the budget in terms of spending on programs to aid the less advantaged. I don't think anybody could disagree that has an effect. And I think government has played a role in creating this income inequality, which I personally don't think is a great place for the country to be. Now, there are a lot of other factors. There's globalization, which I saw firsthand during the auto experience, and I'm happy to talk about. that has played a major role. It's done wonderful things for our country, but it's played a major role in creating more income inequality. But what it's done, and maybe we could just look for one quick second at slide 18, is one of my favorites. What it's done is it has...
That's slide 18.
18, that's not 18. It's not 18 where I have in my version.
Slide 18 reads economic mobility at the top. There we go.
So this is actually from Alan Kruger, who's the chairman of the council. You had it for a second. There we go. Alan Kruger is a really distinguished labor economist, now chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. And essentially what this plots is income inequality. And so you see to the right more unequal countries, and you see the U.S. all the way over on the right. And then top to bottom is essentially what they call earnings elasticity or mobility. And you see the U.S., the second least mobile country after the United Kingdom. And you can plot a regression, and he did that. This is against people who were born in around 1985. And you can see that the more income inequality, the less mobility. Now, that's actually kind of logical if you think about it. The further people are apart economically, the harder it is for them to move from one generation to another into another part of the social order. But I think these are important things, and I think government is not the only cause of the problem, government is not the only source of the solution, but government is a part of it.
Leave that slide up before I come to Jeff, because I want to discuss housing's role in all of this. Neil, let me go to you for one moment. Look, this graph here points out and compares us to nations around the globe. Take this conversation global for one moment as we think about income equality, as we talk about, obviously, the impact that globalization has had on it. How do you see, how is America compared to other countries around the globe? How have we reacted? Are we reacting normally? Is this expected? And how have other countries been able to break out of this?
I think it's very good that we have a comparative perspective here. You can tell from my funny accent that I didn't start out in this country. And I came here, of course, with the American dream, which was to become fabulously wealthy and come to conferences like this. And I've only achieved half of that, unfortunately. Really annoyingly, I've achieved the wrong half. So I think a lot about this. I mean, the American dream to me is about social mobility. It's not about equality. Tocqueville long ago said that equality was what the French preferred, that the US favored liberty. And I think if you had looked at the United States any time in the 19th century, you'd probably have seen very high levels of inequality, but not this correlation, because there was a great deal of social mobility then. What we need to figure out is what has caused social mobility to decline. We know it's declined. It was much higher, according to most measures of this, as recently as the 1970s. And I think part of what makes Charles Murray's book so interesting is that it gives a completely different account of this process from the one I'm used to reading about in the New York Times in the columns of people who'd better remain nameless. This is a story about tax policy, about government policy, about wicked Republican administrations, whereas I think Charles's story is a much more nuanced one. Can we pull up slide, well, I'm going to guess that we have the same numbers now, slide 26 on our sheet. It'll probably...
That's it.
There it is. What we can see if we just, and this is from the enormously important work of Piketty, Atkinson, and also Sayers, if you, which is, by the way, the kind of defining body of work on this issue if you're interested in understanding inequality, this looks at the 1%. Right now, as we have this conversation, there's another wave of Occupy protests going on against the 1%, so it's rather timely to be here talking about this. Well, here we see the 1% in historical perspective, going right back to the early 1900s. And for me, the striking thing about this chart is that it shows that there's a trend in the English-speaking world for the share of the 1% to rise from around about 1980. It rose by the most in the United States, but the trend seems to be just about in all the English-speaking countries, including the United Kingdom, which isn't far behind, and it tracks the US very closely. So we can't possibly say that this is all down to the Bush tax cuts, because so far as I'm aware, those were not applied in the United Kingdom. There were some changes, if only. There were some changes in fiscal policy. Here I agree with Steve. It's partly fiscal. You can't leave that out. But it's about a much more complex set of things. It's about the fact that returns on financial services exploded with the globalization of finance, and financial services are disproportionately located in the English-speaking world. And that's one reason that the 1%, or to be precise, the 0.01%, got suddenly very, very rich. But we're also talking about why the bottom quintile, possibly even more than the bottom quintile, did so much worse. And that, I think, has to be about more than just taxation, or for that matter, government programs. One point that Charles makes, or at least implies in his book, is that things started to go wrong for the bottom quintile precisely when government started to intervene in social life. And in a way, you can trace the breakdown of social order in the lower zip codes, the poorer zip codes, back to the Great Society programs, back to welfare measures that were introduced in the 60s. So I think the picture of why the world has become, or particularly the English-speaking world, has become more unequal is actually highly complex. And the problem of the Occupy movement is that it wants to simplify it into a US-focused, tax and spend-focused debate, which I think is all wrong.
Jeff? Housing obviously played a big role in this changed economic situation in this country over the last 6 years. You were one of the first to point it out, and I might add, you didn't do too bad as you figured it out, pointing out some of the challenges that the country faced, which you're already in the top 1%, but you created another 0.1% and how well you did during that time. How do you react to this cultural versus taxes versus economic policy as someone who employs people and makes investments?
Well, I think that slide that was just up tells the whole story. If we could bring that one up again, I think it's number 10.
26, oh, 10?
I think it was number 10. I mean, you can just see what's happened to the middle class. You can see what's happened to the top 1%. I mean, the top 1%, just if you, in the last 10 years or so, what tripled our income. Is that right? Since 1968, almost tripled our income, and the middle class has actually gone down. I mean, people talk about Japan having a lost decade. The middle class in America has had a lost decade. Middle class median income from 2000 to 2010 has dropped 10%. And I think that we can talk about all these other. I just want to follow up before I get into that on something that Charles said. I mean, he mentioned this conference, how it's not a diverse group. I really wonder what this group would look if Michael Milken had been around 30 or 40 years ago and assembled leaders. What would they look like? I think it would be a lot less diverse. It would be there would be hardly any women here. There would be hardly any minorities here. So I think that in fact there's much more diversity today than there was before. But just to continue on, to get back to your question, I think that all of these cultural issues and housing issues are really not what's happened. What's happened is I think the Western world and the United States was not ready for the high-speed industrialization of China, and nor for the technology revolution. I think that when China opened up, my view was, they're probably going to sneak, grab a few of our jobs, and we'll sell them some stuff. They'll sell us some stuff, and it'll be a very slow-moving train. And nobody was prepared for what they did. And what they did was they just figured out how to make almost everything we can make at a lower cost, same or higher quality, and that's where our middle-class jobs have gone. And if you look at number 12, which I thought was another interesting slide too, it talks about the, look what's happened. This is a really interesting slide that I brought. If you see, in 1970, look at how small the numbers are at the people, of the percentage of the people at the top and the bottom, and look what's happened. The middle class is shrinking, because where are those jobs all going? They're going overseas. And the solution is, unfortunately, a difficult one to come up with, because I don't think tariffs are the answer. I think the reality is we're going to have to struggle through this period while standards of living rise and wages rise in these other countries. We're going to have to muddle through this period and understand that we have to take care of the middle class people in this country and those who are struggling, because you can see on this chart, it's going in the wrong direction. And if the middle class lose another 10% of their income in the next 10 years, it's going to have much bigger implications for our economy, because those are our consumers, and who knows what kind of social unrest. People look at Occupy Wall Street. I mean, this is just a little kind of disorganized joke. If we take away another 10% of middle class America's income, who knows what could happen in this country as far as social unrest and the kinds of changes that could happen to our way of life.
The Milken Institute is about answers. We've outlined some of the challenges and the problems. I want to come back to Neil on this tax issue for a moment, because there'd be a lot of people who would disagree with you about the Bush tax cuts and the cost of it, combined with the cost of the wars. Some would argue that this is the first generation of Americans to go to war without paying for it. If you look at in previous wartime eras, we have raised taxes in this country. We cut taxes during that time, so there are many people who would argue that the Bush tax cuts did have a material and direct impact there. But Steve, for one moment, on the answer equation for a moment, government got directly involved in shaping a policy and helping to resurrect an industry that was critical to America's growth in the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s, our auto industry. Taking that example, how could we apply some of this to address our education challenges? What role can government play there? What role should, obviously in the tax issues, how should we reform our code? How should we address entitlement spending, which you have written about extensively, as we look at how we manage our government's finances and take some of the dysfunction out of Washington that seems to pervade it today?
Well, a couple of things. First, look, I don't disagree with Neil maybe as much as people might think. I think government certainly played a role in creating the problem, but I think the overarching source of the problem, and it's been studied, is really technological change and global competitiveness. And what I saw during the auto experience was a situation where General Motors paid $55 an hour, including benefits, for its traditional workers in the US. In Mexico, it paid $7 an hour, pays today. In China, $4, in India, $1, and it gets productivity in Mexico that's actually higher than what it gets in North America. So you see this relentless downward pressure on wages, which have gone from 55 for new workers at GM down to 28. So I know that's part of the problem. What's the solution? Look, I think at the heart of it, it is about education and training. Sure, we can change tax policy, we can change spending on Head Start and things that Charles might or might not think are a good thing. But if we look at slide 22 just for a second, you can see that really when you cut through all this stuff, it's a lot about education. That if you had less than a high school diploma over the last 30 years, you lost a quarter of your real income. A quarter of your real income. Bachelor's degree or higher, you're up, but actually if you look at the last 10 years, people with just a college degree, in fact, have also had declining real wages. So it's, at the end of the day, it is really about, I think, creating a better educated and better trained for the right jobs, not just having a degree necessarily in philosophy. I hope there are no philosophers here. But look at Germany, which has put so much emphasis on scientific training and on professional training and math and things like that, where, of course, we're way behind. So I think that's where government really can play a role, but unfortunately, we're now caught up in this whole debate about deficits and entitlements and things like that, which have, I think, distracted us from some of these other equally urgent needs.
You say culture. You believe two-parent households are critical. Can't you be one parent in a household and urge your kid to take science and math classes? Can't you be one parent in a household and say, I need you to study hard, and we've got to fight to ensure that we have good schools in our neighborhoods? Doesn't Steve make a good point about the importance of education being the great differentiator here and determinant of how well families do or kids do and families do?
Oh, yeah, and I like the way that Steve put it. We don't necessarily have to say everybody has to get a college degree. The way he said it was, we have to have kids after high school learn how to do things that'll make them a good living and things that they love to do. And we're doing a lousy job of it. And we won't get into an argument right now about what the right reforms ought to be, but I'm foursquare with what he said there.
You argue that two-parent households are better. I don't know how we do that at a public policy level, but what we can do at a public policy level is urge kids to study the things that Jeff talked about at lunch. We need more teachers. We need more engineers. We need more nurses. There are areas where we have a great need as a nation. Should we not use public policy as a tool to encourage that?
Oh, I've got a book called Real Education. It came out a couple of years ago that has things that are very similar to what Steve was just saying, that I'm in favor of. Yeah, public education is a public good. But as long as you've asked about the two-parent households, that is one of the things that lies at the heart of the cultural changes. Look, unmarried dads don't coach Little League teams. Unmarried mothers don't very often get to PTA meetings because they're trying to put food on the table and they're trying to raise kids. Everything that goes into community, when you think about it, is driven by a couple of institutions. One of those is religion, as Robert Putnam has demonstrated in Bowling Alone, which accounts for about half of all social capital that's generated. But families are also the way that social capital in communities gets generated. And that's just a natural phenomenon because so much of what goes into social capital is parents trying to do jointly the right things for their kids and having the resources to do it. So when you have 48% in the white working class, and it's about the same if you consider all races, who are now married, you have had an erosion in community which is profound. And that kind of change has, Harold, an enormous effect on the socialization of kids growing up and the likelihood that no matter what mom says to them about getting more education, the likelihood that they will be in a milieu of which they'll make good on that. So we have a dilemma here. Nobody wants to demonize single women who are trying their hardest to raise their kids in a very difficult situation. But I think it is important because left and right, scholars on the left and right are coming to a consensus about the importance of two-parent families. There's got to be a way we can get that in the air. And I guess there is one group we could demonize without any problem. Let's demonize the guys. Let's say that a man who fathers a child and walks away from that child is a louse. Let's call him by derogatory names. That there is simply no, there's simply no excuse for it, and we start to get judgmental about that. You don't fix this through public policy, the family problem. You fix it through changes in cultural norms.
Jeff, what do we do with the kids, though? There are a number of kids who are growing up in single households. Do we write these kids off? I mean, no. Dr. Murray doesn't believe that public policy can address it. I happen to disagree personally, but how can public policy not play some role
Absolutely.
in helping to ameliorate some of these challenges?
Look, I was an unsuccessful candidate for Senate in Florida, and in being a candidate, I used to go to people's living rooms all over Florida, and I remember going to one living room with my wife in Liberty City, and there was a single mom. She was about 45 years old, probably 300 pounds. She could barely get off the couch to talk to me. She told me she had 5 kids. One had been shot and died in a gang incident. One was in jail. 2 she felt had gang problems. 1 she had a lot of hope for. And you know, people will say, well, why didn't she get a job? I mean, all she was talking about is that she was her $646 check and how it was coming 3 days later so she could go buy more food because she was just about out for the month. And that woman will never work, as far as I'm concerned. It's very unlikely she'll ever get a job, and we're going to be taking care of her the rest of her life. The only question is, what do we do about our kids? And what we do is we need government. It's money. I mean, Alonzo Mourning has a program in Miami, which is a great program. And I tell you, the reason it's a great program, it's almost a 1-to-1 mentor-to-kid ratio. Because the forces that these kids are up against, this single mother who can barely take care of herself, it is what it is. Maybe it's unfortunate that we have situations like this, but she can barely take care of herself. And the role models that kid has are gang members, drug dealers. So of course those kids are going to go in the wrong direction. Look at in LA, I understand the statistic is less than 50% of the kids here are finishing high school. And I think it's not just throwing money at it, but it's recognizing we got a big problem. And if we don't address it in a very big way in this country and start empowering these kids and making sure there's enough education, after-school programs, nutrition, we got to take care of our kids in America. Because if we don't, we're going to take care of them one way or the other. So it's just time for us to wake up, and I think tax policy does have a lot to do with it because, you know, we have to invest in everyone in America. You know, I look at America like, you know, we're one big family, and it would be nice if a lot of these relatives would just pack up and leave, but nobody's leaving. So either we all take care of each other, or we're going to take care of each other one way or the other.
There's a raging debate about taxes here. The president, Neil, is urging the passage of what he conveniently calls the Buffett rule, asking those making $1 million or more, mandating that they pay a minimum of 30% in federal taxes. I don't know how you quite do that, but that debate is raging and dominating Washington. Can an argument be made, put aside the way the tax code is reformed, that some of these monies, as you talk about, people who argue these Bush tax cuts, which expire at the end of the year and will take proactivity on the Congress's part to extend them, that allowing those tax cuts to expire will free up dollars to address some of the issues. We can debate about how the money should be invested. But can a legitimate and credible argument and maybe even a successful argument be made that we can use this revenue in different ways other than giving to the top 1%?
Well, I don't want you to leave people with the impression that I think that the Bush tax cuts had no effect.
I'm going to make you defend that.
No. I'm not going to get boxed into that corner, my dear fellow. But if you...
That accent of yours is not going to get you off the hook here.
And nor is yours. So let's get into the data again. Let's go to slide 27. We can see, if we look at continental Europe, that the problem of the increasing income share of the 1% can, in fact, be avoided. It's not a global phenomenon. And that if you have a more progressive tax system, if you have a more redistributive tax system, go on to slide 28 too for a little bit more evidence of this. It's possible to hold down the 1%'s share. But let's ask ourselves, do we really want the United States to be Europe? I mean, occasionally people make the argument. In fact, I can remember only a couple of years ago, maybe less, somebody saying, look how well Europe works. What a great advertisement for a highly redistributive system of taxation. 2 points. One, clearly Europe is not working well outside of a South German core. And two, if you were simply to let those tax cuts expire, quite apart from the macroeconomic shock that you would administer to the US in a very frail phase of recovery, you wouldn't really make much of a dent in the huge structural deficit in American public finances. And you know that as well as I do. The United States has been running an enormous structural deficit for years now. And it's not just because of tax cuts to a select group of high-income earners. It's also because federal programs have been allowed to expand and will continue to expand in a terrifying way until the nation is on the verge of bankruptcy. There's a great phrase which the Viennese satirist Karl Kraus used of psychoanalysis. He said it was the disease of which it purports to be the cure. And sometimes I think when I hear people urging more federal programs to intervene further in family life, which is what essentially you're saying, it's a classic illustration. Why are there single mothers like that sitting waiting for a welfare check? Because of the expansion of federal programs to make their lives already easier than they were. And what happens next? What happens next? Just follow the order. Let me finish. What happens next? Your proposal takes away from her what little responsibility is left for the raising of her children. So you've got to be very careful here. It is very easy to create yet more problems with well-intentioned welfare measures. We've been doing it for a generation.
In those who clap, do you honestly believe that that woman sitting in that home in Liberty City, Florida, would rather have that life than to have the life of someone sitting here in this room, or that she would rather live that life, live the life that they're living?
But the American dream was that a woman like that could aspire to have the life of people in this room, but not by receiving welfare checks, by working. That was the American dream.
No one differs with that. Neil, Jeff, let me let you respond.
Yeah, but Neil, this isn't about that woman. This is about her kids. This is about the other kids in the neighborhood.
But they'll be mothers in no time at all.
Well,
do you realize how early they start to have the next generation?
You're right.
Look, you've got to learn from the European experience before it's too late. We have created in Western Europe a terrifying dependency culture in which something like a fifth of the population subsists entirely on welfare payments. They live in fragmented families in dysfunctional neighborhoods, and they never work. And it's hereditary. They pass it on to their kids. That's the danger.
That's what we want to stop by having enough funding so these kids are going to after-school programs, they're getting mentors, they're seeing...
Dream on.
Well, you know what? That's the only way you're going to get that to happen, because Harold.
Let me let Steve Radner in on these points that are being made here.
I don't have the accent, so I'm not going to be able to debate Niall and win this fight. But let me make a couple of points. First of all, on taxes, we could spend all afternoon talking about taxes. I could make the point that during the 1990s, we had substantially higher tax rates. This economy grew very fast. We had low unemployment, higher tax rates. There is a point at which it becomes counterproductive. But Clinton-era tax rates did not seem to impede our economic growth. Secondly, we can also debate welfare all day long, too. But in 1997, we had welfare reform. We dramatically cut the amount of money we spent on welfare. And what happened? We have worse social problems than we had before. So it isn't obvious to me that cutting welfare is going to solve our social problems. I'm not advocating increasing it. So let me come back to what Harold asked me a few minutes ago that I didn't quite answer, which is the federal budget. We have a federal budget that keeps its books on a basis that nobody in this room who's in business would recognize. There is no such thing as gap accounting. There's no way to know what money is being spent on consumption versus investment. We have an investment rate in this country of 12, 14% of GDP. China's close to 45% of GDP. The government is being, as you said yourself a minute ago, further and further are spending on things that have a return associated with them. R&D, infrastructure is being squeezed out by entitlements. Our infrastructure, we used to spend about 1% of GDP. It's a quarter of 1% of GDP right now. So when you ask what can government do, if we could get our political act together, I think there's a lot government can do before we start debating about welfare and get into some very highly charged, politicized issues. I think there's more productive things we could be talking about.
Yeah, let me ask you this question. What was, maybe a more fundamental question for, and I hate to identify this young lady, this mother, this American, as this one example that Jeff has laid out, but for sake of argument, what responsibility does government have to her and to her kids, in your mind?
First of all, we have to recognize how she got there. And
No.
no, just let me finish. You
but I mean-
can't pretend that this just happened. In some measure, the creation of a dependency culture was a direct consequence of policy, and there's a lesson there, and that is that the unintended consequences of well-intentioned policies can be very negative. That's point one.
Fair enough.
Point two, I agree with Charles. We can certainly do whatever we can to improve the educational opportunities of these children. And here we're not really in disagreement. I don't think we can do nothing. But we need to recognize that creating a federal program for early education or expanding existing programs will probably have a relatively modest impact because early development is so closely linked to the stability of family life and the habits that are inculcated at home.
I never said a federal program.
Well,
Federal funding
or a
could be
or a
charter
state-
schools,
or a
private
state
programs.
program. So I think one has to be modest in one's ambitions here and recognize that as long as the cultural transformation that Charles is talking about doesn't happen, you will be making fairly marginal impacts with the kind of programs that are being discussed here. That's the harsh reality. And that's why you have to be really careful about embarking on great expansions of the government, whether at the state or federal level, into the realm of private life. They haven't got a great record, and those countries that have done much more than the United States, it seems to me, are not in a markedly...
One can argue that the GI Bill that was instituted to ensure that returning veterans from World War II could get an education played a remarkable role in helping to transform and introduce new legions of people into the American middle class. But so I don't disagree with anything you're saying. A lot of it, I disagree with some of it. But at the end of the day, what role does government, what responsibility does government have to those kids and to that mom? And your argument is we've created a culture of dependency. Say I accept that. What role, you can't write that family off, or perhaps you think they should. And there are millions of families, unfortunately, like that in America today. What is government's role to help that parent who has hope for her one child to ensure that that child does not fall into this culture of dependency that you've described so eloquently?
Well, it's very interesting that you bring up the legacy of World War II, because part of what we're discussing here is the fading away of an enormous impact, which was the impact of the Great Depression and World War II on American society. The reason that we show these charts of inequality back to 1920 is to make a very important point, that what the Depression and World War II did was dramatically to compress income distribution in this country and create a relatively short period, which lasted to the 1970s, of really quite low inequality and quite high social mobility. The problem is, it's very hard to achieve that kind of a shock, both in fiscal terms and in terms of education, without the shock of war. In a sense, what you're really talking about in all these discussions is, can we completely transform our fiscal system and our educational system to get back to the social mobility of the 1950s? And the harsh reality is that doing that in peacetime, when you already have a massive structural deficit with our politics, is virtually impossible. I mean, I would like to have better news for you, but that's the situation that we're in right now. The United States is not in a position to embark on large-scale public solutions to the problems we're discussing. Let me tell you something. The solutions have to come from us. They have to come from the private sector and from philanthropy. Pinning your faith in government is what got Europe into the mess that Europe is in. Now, I think it's perfectly possible to solve these problems through private initiative. Why aren't we talking about that? Because that's part of Charles's story too. Civil society. Where is civil society in all of this?
So this notion that just because I don't see this screaming from your thesis, this notion that philanthropy and the private sector not only trump what government's role is in helping to address some of these problems, but government's role, according to Neil, it should be minimal when we address these issues. In the 50s and the 60s, one could argue that there was significant, smart, contained government involvement in a lot of these areas that encouraged a kind of behavior and encouraged a kind of cultural traits that you believe have contributed so mightily to America's success. My question is Neil right that government's role here is minimal in helping to address? I know you don't believe government alone is the answer, but there were some serious government programs and successful programs that contributed in a lot of ways to some of the cultural successes in the 50s and the 60s.
Well, can we avoid getting into that argument? Because I disagree with you on some of that, but I think it's ancillary. Let me back off, Harold, for a second, and if I could give a quick reading of what I think has happened to the American dream.
Fair enough.
We had some really good things happen in the United States that did start in the 1950s, and chief among those was that we got really good at identifying talent and shipping it off to good schools. An example, 1952, mean SAT verbal score of incoming Harvard freshmen was in the neighborhood of 580. If your kids have 580 on their SAT verbals, they are not applying to Harvard anymore. By 1960, the mean SAT verbal was in the high 600s in the course of 8 years, and then it happened throughout the American university system. This was a success story. It got kids from all kinds of backgrounds, whether racial and economic and geographic, into a chance to realize their talents. That's what meritocracy is supposed to be about. That's great. And that continued for generations afterwards. Problem is that an inherent side effect of that is the development of a new kind of selection process, because as you go from Podunk to Harvard, who do you marry? If you'd stayed in Podunk, you would have married the girl next door, who would not have been particularly selected for being really brilliant. You go to Harvard, and who do you marry? You finish Harvard Law, you are arguing a case across the table with a very attractive opponent from Yale Law School, and you marry her. You have in this room people whose spouses are really, really able. And guess what? You are passing down to your kids not just money, you are passing down to your kids ability. That creates a new kind of tenacity in the upper class that makes the old...
So you think the Big Ten should marry within the Big Ten? And
I'm not talking about...
I don't agree with that.
I'm not saying a should has...
I went to the Ivy League. My wife's from the SEC. Should I not have married her?
Should has nothing to do with it. I am talking about what is and what has happened, as people in this room can verify from their own experience. Shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations doesn't work so much as it did anymore. And this is the result of good things happening in the United States. The more efficient a meritocracy, the faster the churning slows down and you start to get a layer cake. And if you want to explain why income mobility has dropped faster in the United States than in Europe, I think a large part of it is because we were a lot better meritocracy earlier than the European countries were. Now I'm leading up something, Harold, as to what we do about this. You don't ask, first of all, what is government's role, I don't think. I think you ask, first of all, what do I think constitutes living a good life for myself and my children? And part of the answer I would like to see in a crowd like this is, you know, I've got a very glossy life, but I'm not sure I've got that textured a life. That maybe I'm isolated out there in my elegant suburb with people just like me, and I am not engaging very much in the life of my fellow citizens. I'm not saying we should all become social workers. I'm not saying we should move to the slums. I'm not saying we should do anything except look out for our own self-interest to live as rich and rewarding a life as we can, but that might involve changing some of the choices we currently make in the interests of ourselves and our children, and it would be in the direction, I think, of cultural changes that would do a lot more to changing the norms and consequently the behaviors that have produced the social pathologies that we all deplore.
Jeff is inching to get in here before I go to Steve for one moment.
Yeah, I just, by the way, I want to just respond to something Neil said earlier regarding which, you know, what is the role of government? And I don't want to imply that trying to give every kid in America a chance is just the role of government. I think that every kid in America deserves to get to the same starting line. And, you know, some kids, unfortunately, are starting way, way, way back. And I think that whether it's government, it's everyone who's here today who cares so much about our country and that's why they're at this conference. Of course, private sector, you know, philanthropy, churches, synagogues, everyone has to work together, but that's what this is all about, and you can't just ignore these kids. But just to respond to what Charles said, you know, we had a conference call before the panel. He talked about this college, these Yale and Harvard kids marrying each other and this talent pool, and I was thinking, wow, that sounds really interesting. I said, I wonder how I could disprove that, and then I just looked in the mirror. And I realized when I grew up, my dad never went to college. He barely finished high school and joined the Merchant Marines. My mother went to college to study home economics so she could be a good housewife at university. And I had the benefit of going to Johns Hopkins and Harvard Business School. And I think that one thing I found when I got to Johns Hopkins, actually, on scholarships and student loans, a lot of those kids who came from that really prestigious gene pool, and actually whose parents were both highly educated, I remember going to the fraternity party at one of these hotshot prep school fraternities, and these guys couldn't figure out how to arrange their fine china and glassware. And I think there's a lot more to being successful and getting from point A to point B in America than just having two very highly educated parents who went to prestigious schools. You know, learning how to push and shove and getting from point A to point B, which you learn sometimes by not going to those schools, is really what a lot of people in this room have used to get to where they are today.
The role of government.
Hold on, Neil. Let me go.
Sorry,
Steve, is social mobility and upward social mobility defined as narrowly as Charles is suggesting? You think? I think Jeff's refuted part of that. But do you buy this argument? You've bought part of what Charles was saying earlier. Do you buy this last argument
About social mobility being
That the more efficient the meritocracy, the faster the churning slows.
You know, again, I'm not a sociologist. I don't know the answer to that question. But can I just say a word about Neil?
Absolutely.
Because I have,
You get the
I have,
impression
I
they're
have,
ganging up on me.
I have now figured out why he's a star at conferences like the Milken Conference. And I've also figured out why you haven't achieved the level of personal income mobility that you aspire to. Because if you think that our problems are going to be solved solely by the private sector and the government should just get out of the way, then I disagree with you, and I'm not even sure that the evidence supports you. I'm sure you go to China, I go to China. The last time I went to China, the government was still a pretty big factor in that economy, and it was doing really well. Mike Milken put out this little paper that probably everybody got called Where's Sputnik? You know, we didn't catch up to the Russians in space and do everything we've done through the private sector. It was done by government. I believe government has a role to play. I don't believe that anything from the WPA to the GI Bill that you mentioned, to land-grant colleges, 1,000 examples, could have happened without government. Now, I grant you government makes a lot of mistakes, and it's the responsibility of everybody in this room to have government do better by exercising our responsibilities and our rights as citizens, because government is with us. The second point I want to make, though, is I don't want to leave the impression, at least from my own standpoint, that this is all about income inequality, and it's all about social mobility. Those are really important things. But I just want to make sure we don't lose sight of the fact that the most important thing is that we grow the pie, not that we spend all of our time fighting over the slices of the pie and who's getting which slice and whether you're going to move from this quintile to that quintile in the next generation. And so we need to expand the size of the pie, and that gets back to some of the things we've been talking about before, but I just want to make sure we don't have this discussion descend into a simply fighting over pieces of pie discussion.
I think the discussion descended a bit when you made that remark about me not being very well off.
Actually, you made that remark. I was just agreeing with you.
Can I just remind you that, I mean, these elite schools are all very well and terribly important for the reasons that Charles gives, but they still pay professors a rather small amount of money. If there's anything you could do about that, I'd be very grateful. Can I just, I'm sorry, Steve, you've got to make a distinction here. I know caricature the argument is a popular game. But if you'd been here for the whole conference, you'd have heard the panel we had yesterday on the role of the state in the economy. There's a big difference between the role the state played in the era of Eisenhower as a sparking source for technological innovation and the role you're talking about when you discuss the welfare state. The welfare state is not the investment state, it's the transfer state. If you look at government spending as a percentage of GDP, it's nearly twice as high in the US as it is in China because the Chinese got rid of their welfare state. The role of the state in China is completely different from the role of the state in the United States and Europe. So you're confusing people by saying this can all be solved. This kind of state, the state that we've got, the bankrupt entitlement state that exists to transfer money from the successful to the dependent, is not going to generate rapid growth. And if you really want to slow the growth down, then I suggest you follow the Occupy Wall Street line, raise taxes on the successful, increase federal or state programs, see where it gets you. If you don't tackle the fundamental entitlements crisis, if you don't reform the tax code to encourage work, you are going to end up pretty much
what-
where Italy is right now, where Spain is right now.
Oh,
You
come
want to
on,
go there?
come on, come on. What program is it? What program is it that we have expanded so dramatically in the last 10 years that has perpetuated the welfare state? Now, I know Medicare is growing. I know Social Security are growing.
Medicare is
Those
expanding so fast that it's outstripping the rate of growth year after year after year. The unfunded liabilities of this program are
demographics,
dwarfing. Well, the demographics are not exactly irrelevant here. If you design a welfare state for one era and allow it to perpetuate itself into another, don't be surprised if you end up bankrupt as a nation.
So give me the two things you do to Social Security, the two things you do to Medicare, and the two things you do to Medicaid. And before you start, do you support...
that all?
Time out, because this is part of this
How long have we
welfare
got?
state you speak of. In all seriousness, do you support the Paul Ryan reform
Yes.
plan to this?
Yes.
So you believe on Medicaid we ought to block grant most of that to the states?
Yeah.
I'm just giving some of the highlights of it, that Medicare spending should be capped.
Unlike most people in Washington, Paul Ryan has sat there and tried to grapple with these problems. He doesn't pretend it's easy. But if you look at the original roadmap program, the idea of a simultaneous Big Bang reform of the tax system and the entitlement system is the best idea currently open to this country. And all that we're discussing here is kind of secondary to whether or not that happens. If it doesn't happen, it seems to me the path ahead for the United States is fairly clear. It goes down the European route. And that's an extremely unappetizing route for me. My American dream, let me tell you, was to come to a country which was different from that, where the purpose of the state was not to take from the successful and give to the unsuccessful. I come here, and to my utter disillusionment, I find that the United States is in the process of turning itself into a European country, making all the mistakes that we made.
Yeah.
Neil, the government hasn't taken from the successful because the successful, you can see from that chart, the successful have gotten much, much more successful.
Yeah, and
the middle class is going down the tube. So that has not happened in this country at all.
And they've paid an increasing share of
Look,
the tax
the
bill.
problem is that I agree with you that we need tax reform. There's no question we have to raise taxes on those super rich, and we have to get rid of some of these stupid loopholes, have a tax policy that works. We have to reform the entitlement programs. There's no question about it. You know, means testing, raising the age for Social Security. Everyone, I think, is in agreement on that. But the biggest problem is that the government is dysfunctional in every other way. Because, I mean, look, we really want to have solutions. You're talking about growing the pie. I mean, what has the government done in this dysfunctional Washington these last couple of years to help get this economy going? Nothing. And it's the president, and it's the House, and it's the Senate. I mean, look at, a perfect example is, you know, everyone talks about our deficit and our monetary deficit. But you know, what about an infrastructure deficit? I mean, how many people in this room, when you land at LAX, get a real warm, fuzzy feeling when you're coming from Asia and think, wow, this is really a great airport. And then when you get on the San Diego freeway, you think, wow, this is really state of the art. I mean, you know, the truth of the matter is our infrastructure is dilapidated, and whether we leave, what we're confused about in this country is we think that if we don't spend any money, like Steve said, on infrastructure, and we keep the deficit low, we're doing our kids and grandchildren a favor. The fact is, we're leaving them an infrastructure deficit, which is going to cost them so much more to fix them than it would today. And the craziest thing to me is, when you look at interest rates today, the 10-year Treasury is around, what, 2%. Inflation's running around 3%. So basically, we are paying the federal government 1% a year to store our money for us. And meanwhile, you've got 20% of the construction workers are unemployed. You got idle equipment everywhere. And wouldn't it be a great thing if our government, if our executive branch and our House and Senate could get together and come up with a national infrastructure bank, fund the private sector, rebuild our infrastructure, put Americans back to work? That would increase the pie, which is what Steve's talking about. Then we'd have more money to bring that lady's kids out of poverty. And to me, this is what the big problem is.
Jeff,
Neil,
none of that...
do you agree with the investments that, because you talked about government should be involved in helping the economy grow and the state grow. Is this one of the ways in which, because this, again, gets back to my responsibility and accountability government has to people. Take out that, we know what you want to do with that lady and her family in Florida. What's the responsibility government has to society?
So I'm a historian, I'm not an ideologue, and I don't dispute that the state played an enormously important role in American economic history. It was protectionist in the 19th century, very successfully so. It engaged in rampant intellectual piracy at the expense of the United Kingdom in the 19th century, and very successfully so. The Manhattan Project would not have been possible if it had been left to the private sector. All of this is clear. Nor would the interstate highways have been built. All of this is clear. But you cannot reinvent the old state, the state of Eisenhower, until you've solved the problem of the bankrupt state of Lyndon Johnson and Jimmy Carter. You have to address the bankrupt state first. Otherwise, the whole project lacks credibility. Hey, I know we have huge unfunded liabilities on Medicare and Social Security, but don't worry, we're going to redo the highways on yet more borrowed money.
We're going to do it
I
anyway.
mean, that's a pretty
Neil, we're
implausible
going to build them anyways. Do we do it now with our unemployed workers?
And by the way,
cheap money, or do it later?
Let me get the other side of here, just the other side of the stage here.
Look, of
But
course.
Steve, can I ask you a question? Some people point to our deficit problem as our debt problem as a long-term problem. That to balance what Green is saying and what Neil has said, is saying that we can make some of these key strategic investments and at the same time bring down our overall spending if we, and you've written about this, if we address Medicare, Social Security, and deal with it looking out as opposed to the next 2 years, but look at the next 10 to 15 to 20 years. Is that a way to go about this and to find this balance to ensure we don't leave an education and infrastructure deficit as well to our kids and grandkids?
If you want to know the answer to that question, you have to come to my next panel at 2:30 where we're going to discuss the trade-off between austerity and growth. But the answer is, yeah, there is a trade-off. And look, I agree with Neil. Of course we have to deal with the entitlements programs. Of course we have to deal with getting our federal deficit under control. But to your point, and just to preview the next panel, my view is that if we deal with it all right now, we are going to simply worsen our current economic condition. It is something that is a problem that it was created over 40 years since the Great Society, and it's a problem that is going to take a long time to resolve, and we need to resolve it. But let's not also just sort of wave our hands and say, well, we're going to, the Ryan plan is a constructive plan. I agree with you. It's a legitimate idea we should talk about. But before we rush out and adopt it, we should know that under the Ryan plan, the average senior would go from paying 25% of his or her Medicare costs to paying 68% of his or her Medicare costs. And if you want to talk about social pressures and the situation that's disadvantaged, you have to be realistic about what we're talking about doing. So the answer to your question is yes. I think if I were God and I could wave my wand, I would restructure the federal budget. I would spend a lot more on investment-oriented things now, knowing the government won't always get it right. And I would deal with the entitlements program over, say, a 10-year period and try to deal with what Neil is completely correct. There's a huge unfunded liability problem.
In our closing minutes, we have, I guess, concluded that tax rates going up, at least to my right and to your left side of the stage, is not necessarily the answer. That it has to be.
You need a radical tax reform. And here's a really important point.
You got a minute here, because I'm going to give everybody a minute.
I just want to follow on from this very briefly.
That accent's not going to get you over a minute.
If you think, I'll be real quick. If you think about it, the problem is a lot of what we have to do to solve these problems and reignite growth will be in the short term represented on the left as regressive. But that's what we have to do. You can't solve the problems we're talking about just by raising taxes in the 1%. And if it's portrayed as that, it's a phony. The tax reform has to be root and branch, right across the board, and it has to simplify the tax code. The single biggest problem with the tax code is its excessive complexity. Yeah, Ryan's plan will be represented by the Democrats as regressive, as tough on the poor, as beneficial to the rich, but we have to go through that to get to higher growth. If everything is judged just in these European terms of, does it increase the transfer from the rich to the poor, or from the poor to the rich? If that's the only question we ask, we're going to end up with the wrong policy.
Mike Bloomberg argues that all of the tax cuts should be able to expire at the end of 2012. And that will help us pay down this debt and achieve this, reverse this bankrupting of Americans. Yes or no? Do you believe that all of them should expire?
For Mayor Bloomberg, this would be a macroeconomic policy train wreck.
Jeff, the last minute here, the American dream. We've talked a bunch of things here. How do you? I mean, don't react to Neil. I know it's hard not to react to Neil. But try your hardest to give us a sense of where we go from here.
I think this whole debate about the Buffett rule and this 1%, it's unfortunate that it happened because it really. It does ignite kind of a class warfare argument, and the truth is this isn't about class warfare, it's really about fairness. It's what's fair. And it's almost like what's happened in this country, it's almost like we're in this big game, the referee left the playing field, and all the big players and the high speed have overrun the little guys. And this is what's happened to the middle class, and we have to be cognizant of that and do what we can to right this wrong. And I think that the fairness is what we should, and yes, the tax cuts I think they should expire. And we should come up with a much better tax code than we had that people can understand. And we have to be cognizant of the fact that, we can't just leave 50 million Americans without health care. We can't have, right now, the poverty rate in America went up by 1% in the last year to over 15%. We can't have 50 million Americans in poverty. And, there's going to be a lot of different solutions, but I think that the tax code and title reform, hopefully the next Congress will get it right.
The most important thing the private sector can do, and the most important thing government can do, succinctly, to address what you believe is the fundamental problem, the cultural divergence in the country.
I want to take this opportunity to say how wonderful it is to be on a panel where all these arguments I usually have to make have been so brilliantly made by Neil Ferguson. That's my statement.
No answer, you don't, nothing on government?
No, that's it. What Neil says, I'll go along with.
Steve, you have the honor of leading from this one to your next one. Government to private sector, we've had this unbelievable discussion and conversation. You've written extensively in all this. If government could do one thing over the next several months between now and the election to address some of this, and the private sector could do one thing between now and the election, what would they be?
Well, if government could do one thing, it would be to have a long-term agreement on what we're going to do about our fiscal position, not just the deficit, not just entitlements, but getting some of the kinds of spending, at least that I would...
Simpson-Bowles?
Something like Simpson-Bowles, yeah. I mean, look, it's a starting point. It's not perfect. It's never going to be perfect. It's never going to be what we're all going to like, but we're all going to have to compromise. We're all going to have to sign on for something, not to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And yeah, we need something like that. That would actually do an enormous amount, not just for government, but for the private sector, because it would create some confidence, it would create some predictability, it would deal with all this uncertainty. And look, you know, the biggest drop in consumer confidence, the second biggest drop in consumer confidence almost in recorded history was in the summer of the debt reduction debacle. Government is destroying confidence, government is destroying investment. I actually believe that, but I also believe government can lead. But that's the kind of thing we need to do.
Give our panel a round of applause. Thank you very much. Great job. Great job.